the summer sun of July 1941 looked down upon a Soviet Union in flames as the German military machine, unleashed in the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, carved deep into the Eurasian heartland. To the casual observer, the rapid advance of three massive German army groups, north, center, and south, seemed to herald the imminent collapse of the Soviet regime. Panzer spearheads led by legendary commanders like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth had routinely encircled and annihilated entire Soviet armies, leaving a trail of devastation stretching from the Bug River to the Dnieper. Yet, beneath this veneer of operational triumph, a profound and rancorous intellectual schism was festering within the absolute highest echelons of the German military command. The Oberkommando des Heers, the German Army High Command led by General Franz Halder and Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, viewed the unfolding campaign through the traditional, rigid lens of Prussian military orthodoxy. For Halder and his colleagues, the ultimate strategic prize of the entire invasion was the city of Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet administrative, political, and railway systems. They believed with absolute certainty that by concentrating all available armored forces into a single, irresistible thrust by Army Group Center, they could capture the capital, paralyze the Soviet command structure, and force the Red Army into a final, decisive battle that would end the war before the onset of the dreaded Russian winter. This orthodox operational view, however, collided head-on with the deeply ingrained strategic and economic worldview of Adolf Hitler. The German dictator held a fundamental contempt for his generals' traditional military training, frequently deriding them as narrow-minded tacticians who understood nothing of the economic calculations that governed modern industrial warfare. Hitler did not view the conflict in terms of prestigious capitals or map coordinates. He saw it as a desperate, materialistic struggle to secure the raw resources required to sustain a global empire. To Hitler, the primary objectives of the Eastern Campaign lay not in the political halls of Moscow, but in the resource-rich territories of the South, particularly the immense agricultural grain fields of Ukraine, the extensive coal and iron ore deposits of the industrial Donetsk Basin, and the legendary, highly coveted oil fields of the Caucasus. This fundamental divergence in strategic priorities created a highly volatile atmosphere of internal political intrigue and military insubordination at the German headquarters, setting the stage for a fateful decision that would alter the entire trajectory of the war on the Eastern Front. Halder and the staff officers at OKH actively worked to manipulate operational reports, downplaying the strength of Soviet forces on the flanks and exaggerating the vulnerability of Moscow, in a desperate bid to force Hitler's hand and keep the panzer groups moving eastward. They argued that the capture of Moscow would not only destroy the Soviet leadership but also sever the country's primary rail hub, making it impossible for the Red Army to transfer troops or resources between the northern and southern sectors of the front. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, shared this intense fixation on the Soviet capital, believing that the German soldiers' morale was inextricably linked to the capture of the enemy's seat of power. But Hitler remained completely unmoved by these traditional arguments. He looked at the vast German industrial war machine and realized a terrifying truth that his frontline generals blithely ignored: Germany was rapidly running out of the strategic resources, particularly petroleum and specialized metals, needed to wage a prolonged war against the combined industrial output of the British Empire and a potentially mobilized United States. The German economy was operating on a razor's edge, entirely dependent on Romanian oil and precarious imports, and if the Soviet campaigns did not yield immediate, exploitable resources, the entire Nazi war effort would eventually grind to a halt due to industrial starvation. Thus, the intellectual schism within the German leadership was not merely a disagreement over military tactics, it was a fundamental clash between two entirely different philosophies of war, one based on the traditional, rapid destruction of the enemy's main army and capital, and the other based on the immediate, predatory seizure of the economic resources necessary to sustain a multi-front global conflict. As the German panzers halted near Smolensk in late July to refit and resupply, this internal struggle reached a boiling point, forcing a dramatic confrontation that would decide the fate of the entire German campaign in the East. the bitter dispute between Adolf Hitler and the traditional Prussian officer corps over the direction of Operation Barbarossa was fundamentally a conflict of military philosophies, pitting traditional operational dogma against a raw, resource-driven economic realism. Franz Halder and the operational planners of the German Army High Command were products of the prestigious Kriegsakademie, trained in the classic German doctrine of Vernichtungsgedanke, the war of rapid annihilation. This doctrine dictated that the primary objective of any military campaign must always be the destruction of the enemy's main field armies in a series of decisive, concentrated maneuvers, followed immediately by the seizure of their primary political and administrative center. In the context of the Soviet Union, the OKH believed that Moscow represented the ultimate center of gravity. They argued that the Soviet state was a highly centralized system and that the loss of the capital would cause a catastrophic systemic failure, paralyzing the government, breaking the population's will to resist, and rendering the Red Army incapable of organized defense. Hitler, however, possessed a radically different and highly materialistic perspective on modern warfare, influenced heavily by geopolitical theories of Lebensraum and the cold, harsh realities of industrial resource management. The German dictator looked at the global strategic landscape and concluded that traditional military victories were entirely hollow if they did not secure the physical resources required to feed and fuel the nation's industrial core. He openly mocked his general's obsession with Moscow, famously declaring to his entourage that his commander's brains were petrified in old Prussian traditions and that they understood nothing of the economic calculations of modern total war. Hitler realized that the German war economy was operating on a desperately limited timeline. The Reich was completely dependent on external sources of oil, rubber, and metallurgical alloys, and the British naval blockade had severed Germany from global markets. The domestic oil stockpiles that had fueled the blitzkriegs in Poland, France, and the Balkans were rapidly depleting, and the Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti, though vital, were insufficient to sustain a multi-year global conflict, especially with the looming threat of American entry into the war. To Hitler's mind, capturing Moscow would not solve Germany's critical resource deficits. Indeed, occupying a massive, devastated metropolis of millions of people would only create an immense logistical burden, requiring precious food and fuel to keep the population from starving while yielding no tangible industrial benefits. Instead, Hitler's eyes were fixed firmly on the south. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, possessing some of the most fertile black soil on the planet, capable of providing the agricultural yields necessary to feed the German population and insulate the Reich from the devastating effects of another wartime blockade. East of the Dnieper River lay the industrial Donetsk Basin, a powerhouse of coal mines, iron ore extractions, and heavy steel manufacturing plants that could be immediately integrated into the German war industry. And beyond the Donetsk Basin, across the vast steppes, lay the ultimate prize, the Caucasus oil fields of Maykop, Grozny, and Baku, which produced over 80% of the Soviet Union's petroleum. Hitler was convinced that if Germany could capture these economic lifelines, it would simultaneously achieve two decisive goals: it would permanently starve the Soviet war machine of the fuel and food needed to survive, and it would render the German Reich completely self-sufficient and invincible, capable of waging an indefinite war against any global coalition. Additionally, Hitler was deeply preoccupied with the strategic vulnerability of his primary oil supply in Romania. He viewed the Soviet-controlled Crimean Peninsula as an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the Red Air Force could launch devastating bombing raids against the Ploiesti refineries, an event that would instantly cripple the entire German military. Therefore, while Halder and the OKH saw the turn to the south as a dangerous and unnecessary operational distraction that would dissipate the main German strike force, Hitler viewed it as an absolute, non-negotiable economic necessity that took priority over all traditional military objectives. This clash of worldviews created an agonizing deadlock throughout August 1941, as the German army stood at the crossroads of the Eastern Front, caught between the operational lure of Moscow and the economic pull of the southern oil and wheat fields. The intellectual deadlock between the German High Command and Adolf Hitler was finally shattered on August 21, 1941, when the German dictator issued a highly decisive and binding military order that permanently altered the course of Operation Barbarossa. Frustrated by the persistent, passive-aggressive resistance of General Franz Halder and the Army High Command, who continued to draft operational plans focused on the immediate capture of Moscow, Hitler drafted a scathing, detailed memorandum known as Directive 33A. In this document, Hitler explicitly and unequivocally overruled his generals, declaring that the most important objective before the onset of winter was not the capture of Moscow, but the securing of the industrial and agricultural regions of the south. He ordered that the left flank of Army Group South, which had been struggling to overcome stubborn Soviet resistance in Ukraine, must be reinforced immediately by halting the advance of Army Group Center toward the Soviet capital and diverting its powerful armored spearheads 90 degrees to the south. The reaction within the OKH was one of absolute horror and outrage. Halder was so physically and emotionally devastated by Hitler's directive that he seriously contemplated resigning in protest, describing the decision in his private war journal as a catastrophic blunder that would ruin the entire campaign and condemn the German army to a long, winter war for which it was completely unprepared. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch suffered a mild heart attack under the intense stress, while the aggressive commander of Panzer Group II, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, expressed deep frustration, arguing that his tanks were already poised for the final sprint to Moscow and that turning them south would ruin their engines, exhaust their crews, and squander the greatest operational opportunity of the war. In a last-ditch effort to convince the dictator to reverse his decision, Halder and Bock persuaded Guderian to fly directly to Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, to present the army's case in person. On the evening of August 23, Guderian arrived at the dark, heavily guarded bunker complex, determined to lay out the operational arguments for the immediate drive on Moscow. He argued that the Red Army was preparing extensive defensive lines in front of the capital, and that if the Germans did not strike now, before the defenses could be fully manned, the city would become an impregnable fortress. He further pointed out that his panzers had suffered severe wear and tear, and that forcing them to undertake a massive, hundreds of miles march through the dust and mud of Ukraine would cause a logistical breakdown. Hitler, however, listened to Guderian's arguments with calm, icy detachment. Once the Panzer General finished his presentation, Hitler began a long, detailed monologue, speaking without notes and demonstrating an astonishing command of economic statistics, raw material production numbers, and industrial capacities. He explained to Guderian that without the coal of the Donets Basin, the wheat of Ukraine, and the oil of the Caucasus, Germany would face economic strangulation within a year. He asked Guderian how he proposed to run his tanks if the Romanian oil fields were destroyed by Soviet bombers flying from Crimea, and pointed out that the seizure of Ukraine's agricultural wealth was essential to prevent a repeat of the devastating food riots that had contributed to Germany's defeat in the First World War. Hitler's performance was so logically cohesive and persuasive, grounded in the brutal realities of industrial warfare, that Guderian found himself completely unable to refute the economic arguments. Under the spell of Hitler's powerful personality and seemingly flawless logic, Guderian surrendered his objections, agreeing to execute the southern pivot without further delay. When Guderian returned to his headquarters, Halder was furious to discover that his star panzer commander had been completely won over by the dictator. The orders were officially cut. Panzer Group II, along with Field Marshal Gunther von Kluger's Fourth Army, was halted on its eastward path, turned 90 degrees to the south, and ordered to drive deep into the rear of the Soviet forces defending Kiev, initiating the most massive and consequential operational maneuver of the entire conflict. The execution of Adolf Hitler's southern pivot initiated the Battle of Kiev, an operational maneuver of such staggering proportions that it would become known as the largest encirclement in the entire history of human warfare. In late August 1941, Colonel General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group II began its rapid, southward drive, slicing through the boundary between the Soviet Central and Southwestern fronts. This sudden, powerful movement caught the Soviet Stavka, the high command in Moscow, completely off guard. For months, Marshal Semyon Budyonny, commanding the Soviet Southwestern direction, had been desperately trying to hold the Dnieper River line against the relentless frontal assaults of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South. Budyonny's forces, consisting of several highly decorated but severely depleted field armies, were heavily concentrated in and around the city of Kiev, forming a massive, deep salient that protruded westward into the German lines. As Guderian's panzers advanced rapidly from the north, they began to threaten the vital railway lines and supply routes that connected Budyonny's massive force to the Soviet rear. Simultaneously, from the south, Colonel General Ewald von Kleist's Panzer Group 1, which had been operating under Army Group South, launched a powerful armored thrust northward from its bridgehead across the Dnieper River at Kremenchug. The two German panzer groups, operating like the massive jaws of a titan, were driving toward a meeting point deep in the Soviet rear, threatening to trap the entire southwestern front in a gargantuan pocket. Inside the threatened pocket, the situation was rapidly deteriorating into complete chaos. Budyonny and his chief of staff, General Vasily Pokrovsky, clearly recognized the mortal danger facing their armies. In early September, Budyonny repeatedly sent urgent, pleading messages to Joseph Stalin in Moscow, requesting immediate permission to abandon Kiev and withdraw his forces eastward to the line of the Seal River before the German panzers could close the trap. Stalin, however, was paralyzed by a rigid, politically motivated refusal to yield territory, particularly a city of such immense historical and symbolic importance as Kiev. The Soviet dictator viewed any retreat as an act of cowardice and treason, firmly believing that if the Red Army held its ground and fought tenaciously, it could exhaust the German offensive. Stalin dismissed Budyonny from his command for defeatism, replacing him with Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, and issued a strict, non-negotiable order: Kiev must be held at all costs, and no withdrawal was to be permitted under any circumstances. This disastrous, politically driven decision sealed the fate of the Soviet forces. On September 14, Guderian's Panzer Group 2 and Kleist's Panzer Group 1 made physical contact near the town of Lokvitsia, approximately 120 miles east of Kiev. The steel jaws had officially snapped shut, trapping for entire Soviet field armies, the 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th, along with elements of two others, within a colossal pocket that measured over 130 miles across. The trapped Soviet soldiers, lacking fuel, ammunition, and coordinated leadership, made desperate, uncoordinated attempts to break out of the encirclement, but their attacks were systematically repulsed by the surrounding German infantry divisions. What followed was a systematic, two-week slaughter within the Cauldron. German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers relentlessly pounded the concentrated Soviet positions, turning the beautiful forests and fields of Ukraine into a hellish landscape of mud, fire, and blood. By the time the last pockets of resistance were officially liquidated in late September, the scale of the German victory was unprecedented. Over 665,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured, along with thousands of tanks, heavy artillery pieces, and supply vehicles. The Soviet Southwestern Front had been completely wiped off. The military map, leaving a massive, 500-mile gap in the southern sector of the Soviet defensive line. To many in the German high command, it appeared to be the decisive operational victory that would break the back of the Soviet Union once and for all. The catastrophic destruction of the Soviet Southwestern Front at Kiev instantly cleared the path for the rapid realization of Adolf Hitler's ambitious economic and resource-driven goals in the south. With the Soviet southern wing completely shattered and no organized reserves left to oppose them, the German armies swept eastward across the rich, rolling steppes of Ukraine like an unstoppable tide. The primary objective of this phase of the campaign was the immediate, predatory exploitation of the captured territories to fuel the Reich's war economy and secure the strategic southern flank. The first and most immediate prize was the agricultural gold of Ukraine. The region's legendary black soil, or Chernozem, was the most fertile agricultural land in the world, capable of producing millions of tons of wheat, rye, and barley. Under the ruthless direction of Herbert Back, the state secretary in the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the German occupation authorities immediately began implementing the hunger plan. This deliberate, genocidal economic policy aimed to seize the entire agricultural surplus of Ukraine and ship it directly to Germany to feed the German civilian population and the frontline troops, while deliberately starving millions of Soviet citizens in the occupied cities. The seizure of Ukraine's agricultural wealth was seen by Hitler as a vital domestic triumph, ensuring that the German home front would not suffer the severe nutritional privations and subsequent social unrest that had led to the collapse of the German Empire in 1918. Beyond the agricultural fields, the German advance drove deep into the industrial heartland of eastern Ukraine, the legendary Donetsk Basin, commonly known as the Donbas. The Donbas was the industrial engine of the southern Soviet Union, containing some of the largest and most productive coal mines, iron ore extractions, and heavy metallurgical steel works in the world. Cities like Stalino, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk were captured in rapid succession. Hitler placed immense importance on these industrial assets, establishing a specialized economic staff, the Wirtschaftsstab, to oversee the immediate repair and operation of the captured coal mines and steel mills. The Germans hoped to utilize the Donbass's massive coal deposits to fuel their railway networks and power stations in the east, while using the local steel works to manufacture spare parts and munitions for the advancing armies, thereby reducing the immense logistical burden on the German transport system. Simultaneously, to the south, the German 11th Army, commanded by the brilliant General Erich von Manstein, launched a grueling, highly contested assault to break through the narrow Perekop Isthmus and capture the Crimean Peninsula. For Hitler, Crimea was a strategic obsession. He repeatedly referred to the peninsula as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, expressing deep anxiety that Soviet bombers operating from Sevastopol and other Crimean airfields could launch devastating air raids against the Romanian oil refineries at Ploiesti. Romania was the absolute lifeblood of the German military, providing over 60% of the Reich's petroleum, and the destruction of its refineries would have instantly grounded the Luftwaffe and immobilized the panzers. Manstein's forces fought a series of brutal, bloody battles, successfully breaching the Soviet defenses and sweeping across the Crimean plains, isolating the massive Soviet naval fortress of Sevastopol and neutralizing the immediate air threat to the Romanian oil fields. By the end of October 1941, Hitler's economic strategy appeared to have achieved a stunning, unparalleled success. The Reich had secured the breadbasket of Europe, captured the richest industrial coal basin in the Soviet Union, and eliminated the aerial threat to its vital oil supply, seemingly vindicating Hitler's economic realism over the traditional military orthodoxy of his generals. As the crisp autumn air of October 1941 settled over the Eastern Front, the German High Command made a desperate, final attempt to resume the drive on Moscow, launching Operation Typhoon. Franz Halder and the staff at OKH believed that despite the weeks spent in the south, they could still capture the Soviet capital before the onset of the brutal winter. But the strategic and logistical realities had permanently, irrevocably changed. The 4-week delay caused by Adolf Hitler's southern pivot had given the Soviet leadership invaluable time to fortify the approaches to the capital, mobilize hundreds of thousands of civilian workers to dig massive anti-tank ditches, and, crucially, transfer elite, winter-trained Siberian divisions from the Far East after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not launch an invasion of Siberia. When the German panzers finally resumed their advance toward Moscow, they were already operating on borrowed time. The severe wear and tear suffered by the tanks during the long, grueling march to Kiev and back had critically depleted their operational strength, leaving many division commanders with less than half of their authorized armored vehicles. Furthermore, the German logistical system, stretched to its absolute breaking point across 1,000 miles of devastated territory, was completely incapable of supplying the advancing forces with the winter clothing, spare parts, and fuel needed for a prolonged offensive. In mid-October, the dreaded Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, descended upon the Russian steppes. The unpaved roads of the Soviet Union turned into deep, viscous seas of thick mud, brought the entire German offensive to a grinding halt. Supply trucks sank to their axles, and horse-drawn transport columns, upon which the German infantry heavily relied, collapsed from exhaustion. When the ground finally froze in November, allowing the advance to resume, it was accompanied by a catastrophic drop in temperature to sub-zero levels. The German soldiers, still clad in their thin summer uniforms due to the logistical failure to transport winter gear, suffered tens of thousands of severe frostbite casualties, while tank engines and artillery mechanisms froze solid, rendering them completely useless. On December 5, 1941, the exhausted, depleted German spearheads, having reached the absolute limit of their physical and logistical endurance, were halted just miles from the spires of the Kremlin. At that exact moment of maximum German vulnerability, General Georgy Zhukov unleashed a massive, unexpected Soviet counteroffensive, utilizing fresh, heavily armed Siberian divisions equipped with specialized winter gear and the legendary T-34 tanks. The Red Army struck the overextended German flanks with devastating force, pushing the Germans back in complete disarray and inflicting the first major, permanent strategic defeat on the Wehrmacht since the outbreak of the war. The southern pivot, while yielding an unprecedented operational victory at Kiev and securing immense economic assets, had ultimately cost Germany the single thing it could not afford to lose: time. By delaying the assault on Moscow, Hitler had allowed the campaign to drag into a winter war of attrition, the exact scenario the German Blitzkrieg doctrine was designed to avoid. In the final strategic analysis, the southern pivot of 1941 represents the ultimate, tragic paradox of the German war effort, a brilliant economic and operational triumph that directly catalyzed the strategic collapse of the entire invasion, setting the Wehrmacht on a slow, agonizing path to total defeat on the Eastern Front.